Good morning, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to week 4 of the Introduction to Buddhism. And this week, we're going to be talking about Vipassana. So let me show you the outline. We're going to start with an introduction to Vipassana. It'll be quite experiential, so we'll follow where we started last time with the idea of the observational stance. We'll explore a little bit of our body and our breath, mindfulness, and how that can lead us to the truth. And then we'll talk about the idea of practice as a way of getting used to the truth. Now, the second part, we'll talk about view, how that's the foundation of the path in Buddhism, and in particular, the way that appearances are not reality, and how life can be seen as cinema. And the final part, learning to see the truth, just transitioning a little bit from the idea of Vipassana and view into the idea of practice, right? How do we make this real for us over the longer term? So I want to start very briefly by talking about how Vipassana is currently understood in the West, because it's become very commonplace. It's used everywhere to treat stress, anxiety, PTSD, also to help with happiness, focus, productivity. And really the current way of thinking about mindfulness in the West started with Jon Kabat-Zinn, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. He was a Zen practitioner, a student of the Korean Son master Sung San, and he was treating patients who had untreatable chronic pain. Right? There was no medical way he could make their pain go away. And so he became curious. I wonder if there's a way that rather than try and remove the pain, I can help them change their relationship to their pain. And so he experimented with various forms of mindfulness, including physical yoga as well. And that turned into the now famous 8-week MBSR program. In 1979, he founded the Stress Reduction Clinic at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. And as I say, the rest is history. His definition is still very much used in Western definitions of mindfulness. He said, mindfulness is the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. There's another big strand of the way we approach mindfulness in the contemporary world, which came from what happened in Burmese Buddhism in the late 19th century and the 20th century, because there were a number of reformers in Burma who were actually influenced by Western modernism and wanted to make Buddhism more accessible for lay people. And starting with Ledi Sayadaw, he popularized Vipassana meditation for lay people. And then in the early 20th century, Mahasi Sayadaw introduced something called the New Burmese Satipatthana method, alongside Goenka and other teachers, who then became very influential because many Western students accessed them and their teachers. For example, in the US, the Insight Meditation Society was founded in 1975 by Sharon Salzberg, Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, all of whom came from that lineage, right? And so, American Buddhism, not just mindfulness, is very influenced by that way of thinking. And we'll talk more about that next week when we talk about the 4 foundations of mindfulness. But just to say that it is a way of approaching Buddhism that's very based on a mindfulness practice, right? Paying attention to the sensations of the rising and falling of the abdomen during breathing, and observing carefully any other sensations or thoughts. Also teaching some Buddhist teachings on causality, and thereby gaining insight into the nature of mind, the nature of reality. So it's based on a very classical Theravada, the root teachings of Buddhism. unfortunately, although John Kabat-Zinn was trained in Buddhism and he says he espouses its principles, he also says he very much rejects the label of Buddhist, and he says he prefers to apply mindfulness within a scientific rather than a religious frame. And I think, given his influence in the field, that way of thinking has become quite consequential for the way in the modern world people approach mindfulness and, by extension, how they approach Buddhism. Because he downplays the three marks of existence, which we touched on briefly and we'll talk more about today. Those are not something that can be measured scientifically, right? He's focused on things that you can measure, changes in hormones, changes in body chemistry, in brain waves, right? Stress, physiological markers, EEG, MRI machines. It's a little bit like in business we say, what gets measured gets managed. And I think that's given rise to a bit of a framing where Buddhism is bad, science is good. And I think even more than that, you see now some, what I think are somewhat misguided attempts to portray Buddhism as a science, right? Because I think there's a bit of a feeling that, we need to prove that we can be treated that way. I think that's not very helpful, because the aim in Buddhism is different from this aim of stress reduction or dealing with our physiology. Not that it's against that, of course not, right? But at the same time, you can't measure truth or wisdom in an MRI machine, right? And that the aim of the Buddhist path and the Buddhist practice of Vipassana is to see the truth, right? The truth of reality, the truth of our own minds. And I think that's why many scientific people don't want to go there. It sounds philosophical, sounds religious, very much frowned upon in academia. But as we said last week, the truth is not magical or mystical. It's actually very simple. It's too close, almost like our own eyelashes. So what does this word vipassana actually mean? Well, passana is a Pali word that just means seeing, and vi is a prefix that has the context of seeing more, seeing extra, seeing something special, as Rinpoche says, the real deal, the true color. And it's deceptive because whenever we hear words like insight or true color, we assume there's something magical, something mystical, something more than we can ordinarily see, which is not the case. But nevertheless, this idea that appearances is not the same as reality, we know a person may appear to be polite and gentle, but when we get to know them, maybe they're not like that at all, right? Maybe the real deal is not the same as our superficial understanding. Right? Vipassana is not the same as ordinary seeing, ordinary observation. And as we said before, yes, if you want to use Vipassana as a way of stress reduction, good sleep, better focus, better leadership, of course, it can help. But as Rinpoche said, that's a bit like using gold leaf to wipe your bottom, right? If you want to relieve your stress and anxiety, as he said, go wash a buffalo. It's very soothing. Massage, soft music, things like that, right? In Buddhism, we are focused on the root cause of your stress, your suffering, right? And here the idea is, if you're living a life of deception, either about yourself or about other people or about the world, then that's either stress or it's a cause of stress. We really believe you need to see the truth. Okay, so we're going to talk about that this week. But let's go back to the mind itself, the observer. We talked about this last week. We have this cognizance, this power of observing. We're constantly seeing and hearing and sensing. A table can't do this. Right? And as Rinpoche said, we don't do much to appreciate this observer. I was reminded of Thich Nhat Hanh's lovely story of the joy of non-toothache. He said, when you have toothache, all you can think about is how much you want it to go away. And when finally it goes away, maybe you've seen the dentist or taken a painkiller, for those first few hours after it goes, there is this wonderful experience which he calls the joy of non-toothache. Right? You really appreciate how much it's gone, but that wears off, and after a few days, you've completely forgotten. Right? You've lost that appreciation of the joy of non-toothache. Similarly, I've had friends who've contracted COVID. They've lost their sense of taste, and they said, so strange not to be able to taste anything. There's one woman who's following these teachings, and she wrote to me to say how much she appreciates the transcripts because sadly she's lost her hearing. Right? She's never going to be able to hear the Dharma again. And she said, without the transcripts, she'd really become disconnected from these teachings. Yeah, so just, I think, pausing for a moment to appreciate what we have. We don't often do that. And of course, our awareness, our cognizance, is the root of all of that. And we're going to talk about awareness, about observation, right? The observational stance is very much at the heart of mindfulness and Vipassana. And that requires us to be present, right? To be non-distracted, to pay attention to the present moment. Because if we're thinking about the past and the future, we can't observe what's happening right now. I think the attitude, again, Thich Nhat Hanh sums it up nicely. He said, if while we're washing the dishes, we think only of the cup of tea that awaits us, and thus hurrying to get the dishes out of the way as if they're a nuisance, then we're not washing the dishes to wash the dishes. What's more, we're not alive during the time we're washing the dishes. In fact, we're completely incapable of realizing the miracle of life while standing at the sink. If we can't wash the dishes, the chances are we won't be able to drink our tea either. While drinking the cup of tea, we'll only be thinking of other things, barely aware of the cup in our hands. Thus we're sucked away into the future, and we're incapable of actually living 1 minute of life. So I really want to encourage us to approach our practice with that attitude. So we have this observer. Let's just take a moment, pay attention to this observer. Right? As we said before, no need to sit straight or anything, just look at it. What is it? So, we might call it mind. Perhaps scientists might call it brain. Jack or Jill or Wong or Deng. We give it names. But we have it, right? We don't need to download it. We can't lose it. It's the most important part of who we are. So how can we not pay attention to it? So let's look again. Right? Without any influence, without any beliefs, anything we've read in books or taken from religion or science or philosophy, all that's useless. Right? Just observe fully, open-mindedly, without prejudice. Okay, so that's it, right? And that's what we're going to use, that cognizance, that observation, that observer. And we'll talk more about how we can train it next week and in future weeks. But in a way, it is our instrument, right? It's like a chef has a knife to cut vegetables. or a scientist has an instrument to observe things. And our mind is our instrument. And so part of what we want to do is to, sharpen our knife, to clean our instrument. But when we look, as Rinpoche said, we don't want to find anything, right? We don't want to name it. Like in the Tao Te Ching, the name that can be given is not the name. Right? Red Pine translates these lines as, the way that becomes a way is not the immortal way. The name that becomes a name is not the immortal name. And he also quotes the Buddha's words from the Diamond Sutra in commentary. He says, he who says I teach the Dharma maligns me. Who teaches the Dharma teaches nothing. Yeah, so obviously this is not intended to be nihilism, and we'll talk more about this in week 6. But it's inviting us to look at our habit of naming, reifying, solidifying, right? Turning phenomena into nameable objects. And of course there's a risk we're going to do that with our mind also. But knowing that risk, let's just call it observer for now. Yeah? And as we saw, it also observes itself. It has this remarkable capacity of self-awareness. We don't need another observer. It's like turning on a light in a dark room. You don't need another light to see the one that you just turned on. So we'll talk more about that as well. So as we said last week, yes, we have this mind. We're stuck with mind, though. And it can be painful, right? We don't always like it. There's this feeling of stress, anxiety, unsatisfactoriness. And so, with our control freak-like nature, we try to control it. We distract ourselves. We numb ourselves. Now, last week we talked about how we can numb and distract ourselves with TikTok, social media, or perhaps the desire to build super tall skyscrapers. This week, I also want to talk about concepts. Rinpoche said, it's called education. It sounds strong as a criticism, right? Because isn't education something good? Well, yes, of course it's good. We need it, right? We need it to survive and thrive in the world. But I think we can forget how easily we reify. We get enmeshed in the web of language and concepts that we learn. Right? We think we're understanding, but actually we misunderstand. We mistake the world for our words and our concepts. There's a lovely story about the famous experiment done with the Me'en people of Ethiopia, who were presented for the first time with photographs of people and animals, because the anthropologists were curious, how would they respond? But they were completely unable to read the two-dimensional images. They felt the paper, sniffed it, crumpled it, listened to the crackling noises it made. They even nipped off little bits and chewed them to taste it. Now, people in the modern world, we easily equate a photographic image with an object that is photographed, even though the resemblance is only very abstract. There was a story of Pablo Picasso traveling by train once, and a man sitting opposite him said, "Why don't you paint people the way they really are?" Picasso asked what did he mean by that expression. And the man opened his wallet and took out a snapshot of his wife, saying, "That's my wife." Picasso responded, "Isn't she rather small and flat?" So for the Me'en people, there were no photographs, even though they were in their hands, as plain as day. They saw nothing but shiny paper. It's only through the conventions of modern life that we actually can read the photograph and see the image in the photograph. So I want to use that example just to start us off on a journey of exploration about what do we actually think we're seeing, right? What is our view? And are we actually seeing reality for what it is? So this is going to be a core question in Buddhism. Because, as we said last week, yes, we have this mind, this cognizance, this awareness, but it is shrouded, it is covered with defilements like a dirty window. Yeah, and because of that, we get caught in mistaken views, emotions, ignorance, and our actions and reactions coming from that place become what are termed non-virtuous actions. We cause suffering for ourselves and for others. And so our aim then is to try and clear away these wrong views. Let's remember the Four Noble Truths. First noble truth is that we experience suffering and unsatisfactoriness, anxiety, stress, depression. And this is the second noble truth, rooted in our clinging. Now the additional point we're going to make this week is, yes, that is right, and the clinging itself is founded on wrong views, right? So we're going to talk more about view. Yeah, the result, no change, right? It's this state of the Buddha, the state of the Tathagata, the cognizance. And the path, we're going to talk more this week about eliminating wrong views and establishing the right view. And seeing the truth, right, it changes your attitude. Rinpoche gave a lovely example of, imagine a wife came home one day and just briefly spotted that her husband had a tail. One glimpse changes everything. All of a sudden she's asking herself, who am I married to? I saw it. When he comes home from work, the way she'll greet him will change. When he eats dinner, she'll be wondering, does he really like this food? And one glimpse changes the attitude. Right? And so that's the way we also want to think about the view and the practice of Vipassana. Right? How, as we glimpse the truth, it will change our attitude. Okay, so let's do another experiential way of approaching this. So there's many traditional meditations that are mindfulness of the body. We'll just do one briefly. You don't have to sit in any particular way. But just whatever way you're sitting or standing or lying, just observe your body. So start with your toes. Just bring your awareness to your toes. You don't have to do anything, no need to move them or change them or wiggle them or anything. Just observe. Observe them. Your feet, your ankles. Observe your calves. Feel the knees, thighs. Maybe if you're sitting on a chair, you can feel the contact with the chair. Your hips. What about your back? Perhaps you'll notice, are you sitting straight or slouching? Again, no need to change, just observe, just notice. Your fingers, your hands, your arms. And notice your shoulders. And your neck. Is there tension there perhaps? Or your head? Observe your body as a whole. Now bring your awareness back to the head, ears, the eyes. Maybe you can even feel them in their sockets. The mouth and the nose. Maybe you can notice the movement of the breath coming in and out of the nostrils. Maybe notice it's slightly cooler on the in-breath, slightly warmer on the out-breath as it's been warmed by the body. And now notice the movement of the breath in the body, in the chest, in the abdomen. Just follow the movement of the body as you breathe, just for a few moments. Just noticing, just observing. Maybe you'll become distracted. That's okay. Gently bring your awareness back to the movement of the breath, the body. So what do you notice? What do you observe? Okay. So you may already have noticed this, but if not, here's some thoughts about what, if you continue to do this, what you might well notice. For example, one of the first things you might notice is there's no such thing as a whole, right? It's actually parts. You might first think of your hand as a complete hand, but if you really notice, wow, there's blood, there's bones, there's muscle, there's sinews, there's nails. Right? It's actually parts, there's no whole there. Another thing you'll notice is what we might normally think of as permanent is actually impermanent. We might habitually think of the body as unchanging, but even just noticing the breath go in and out, noticing the sensations that come and go, noticing that we have a desire to shift our weight around. Saliva collects in our mouth. We swallow. Our eyes get dry. We blink. We notice after a while the body becomes uncomfortable. We want to shift and move. Any position is unsatisfactory. And we also start to notice that the body isn't independent. We start to notice the support of our chair or our cushion, whether or not we find it comfortable. We notice the temperature of the room, the ambient noise. Or if we practice for several hours, we'll start to notice that we need food and water. We notice the need for fresh air. We even perhaps might notice that we're dependent on the architect and the builder of our house, the fact that the roof hasn't collapsed in on us. Yeah? So our experience, our very existence is dependent, right? It's not independent. So already we're now starting to practice Vipassana, right? We're looking beyond the surface appearances to notice something about their nature. And if you keep going, you'll notice three truths, right? This is the three truths we touched on already. The first is impermanence. Everything is always coming, going, arising, decaying, changing, drifting, shifting. You breathe out, it's gone. There's nothing magical about that. It's just raw truth. Yeah, we might think that change is bad, but change is also good. It allows fresh things to come in our life. The second is unsatisfactoriness. There's no ultimate satisfaction in anything. Even things we enjoy, like ice cream. Yeah? Too much makes us sick, gain weight. Even getting the right flavor and texture is so hard. And even if we do get the right flavor and the right amount, pleasure wears off. Everything is like this, right? In psychology, we call it Hedonic Treadmill. Even when you're observing your breathing, maybe at the beginning it was nice just to pause and relax, but after a while we get fidgety, anxious, distracted, bored. And we don't want to spend time with our observer anymore. We feel there's things we need to do, we're wasting time. The third thing we'll notice is non-self. You'll notice as you observe your body and its parts, there's no true identity, not even true characteristics. There's nothing that's truly thin or truly fat, truly beautiful, truly ugly. All comes together with causes and conditions. Even your breath, right? Where does your breath start and stop? When you breathe out, where does it go? When you breathe in, what are you breathing in? Now, with the summer of forest fires and air pollution and COVID, I think we're all more sensitive to that. But supposedly, with every breath, we're breathing in one molecule of Julius Caesar's last breath, or Hitler's, maybe even the Buddha's. When did it stop being his and start being yours? Right, likewise, sitting at a table, it has legs, it has a top, it has a cup. But if I sit on my table, suddenly it's become a chair. It has no fixed identity as a table. It's like the people not seeing the piece of paper as a photograph. Now you may ask, why do we use body and breathing? That's nothing holy about it, but it's free, it's always with you, and it's very practical, right? By observing the breath, you can see these three marks. It's also one of the traditional methods in the sutras, right? So it's an original Buddhist method. And I know we use the word mindfulness, but as I said, there's a difference between pasana, which is seeing, and vipassana, which is seeing the truth. Because if you're just mindful, if you're just observing, but not observing this real deal, these three marks, the nature, then you're just present to your everyday worldly confusion and unsatisfactoriness. Right? You may see it, that's good, but you're not yet moving beyond it. So what happens, right? If we keep doing this, what happens? Well, yes, our attitude changes, but that doesn't mean we're suddenly going to give up on our life. Right? We can see the three truths of the body, but we'll still exercise, we'll still dress nicely, we'll still use moisturizer. We'll do the same things, but we'll do them differently, with a different attitude. So the example of the sandcastle, right? Imagine it's a beautiful sunny day at the beach, and there's some parents with their children building a sandcastle. And they build the castle, and then the tide starts to come in, starts to wash away the sandcastle. The kids, they might be upset, especially if this was the first time they built a sandcastle. But the parents, they knew the tide was coming, right? They really enjoyed building the castle. They had lots of fun with the kids, but they weren't expecting lasting pleasure. They weren't expecting a permanent sandcastle. You could say they were not attached. They had some form of renunciation. And of course they have compassion for their child's experience. I think sometimes we hear these three marks, the idea of impermanence and unsatisfactoriness and non-self, and we read them as very negative or pessimistic, but not at all, right? It doesn't mean once you understand these three marks that you suddenly become nihilistic or uncaring. Indeed, if you are, it's a sign you have the wrong view. No, far from it. You're still going to have fun with your children. You'll still make your sandcastle big and beautiful. You'll really make it nice. If anything, you're more present. You're less obsessed. Right? You have more fun because you know the truth. You do a beautiful job, you have fun with your kids, and then you let go. If ever you've seen Tibetan monks building sand mandalas, it takes them many days to do it, and at the end they just destroy this intricate, beautiful construction. And they collect up all the sand and just make it into one mass. They're fully engaged, and then they dissolve and fully engage in the next thing. Just like Thich Nhat Hanh's story of making the cup of tea. Whereas most of us, we're not very good at that, right? We're always multitasking. We have a continuous, partial attention, and that causes tremendous unsatisfactoriness, and it's just not good for us or for others in a worldly sense either. But it's quite, I think, unusual to be doing one thing at a time. I remember many years ago I was with Rinpoche in Kathmandu on Christmas, and we had Christmas dinner and were joined by a Tibetan Lama called Ugyen Tobgyal Rinpoche, a Kampa from East Tibet, big and rather fearsome in his expression, but actually a very kind master. And I remember, we ate, we talked, and at the end of dinner, he stood up, he turned around, and he walked out of the door. He didn't do any sort of fond farewells or goodbyes or hugs or kisses. And I was quite surprised. I'd never experienced that. And of course, it felt rude to my, Western sensibilities. But Rinpoche, he clarified. He said, no, for him, he's there when he's there. And then once it's done, right? It's dissolved. He moves on to the next thing. There wasn't any hint of rudeness for him. He was just very present in whatever he was doing. And I still remember that because it was so different from some of the ways we become so sentimental and so unable to let go and move on from one thing to the next thing. Right? We're always thinking of the last thing, thinking ahead to the next thing, even at work, going from meeting to meeting. The last meeting's always on our mind as we move into the next meeting, right? How can we find a way to actually be present in what we're doing? I also wanted to talk a little about the idea of impermanence, right? The first of these 3 marks. For those of you who saw the movie The Dead Poets Society, Robin Williams has this lovely line where he's reciting a poem. He says, "Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. Old time is still a-flying, and this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying." Right? I think we have this idea, if we think about it, of wow, yes, time is passing, time is precious. Each day comes but once. Yeah. There's also reflection on impermanence. It's one of the most famous Shakespeare sonnets, number 18. He says, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed." Yeah, so far so good, right? I think Shakespeare's pointing us to the natural state of things, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness. And you would think, actually, yeah, that's a beautiful reflection on impermanence. And then I think the next and final part of the sonnet, I think that's where we get into trouble, right? Because now he starts to express how his love for his beloved is different from this kind of impermanence. He continues, "But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee." Yeah, I think that's more typical of our usual experience. Yeah, love is blindness, love is madness. And of course, we like to fall for that blindness and madness. We kind of glorify it, much as Shakespeare did. But we're going to be disappointed if that's how we enter into things. Rinpoche often jokes there's no such thing as a Buddhist marriage ceremony, and maybe actually it would be better if we were to do a divorce ceremony when people got married, right? Just to remind them that all things are impermanent, right? Like the sandcastle. But if we have that experience, that knowledge of the 3 marks, then we can enjoy love, passion, obsession even, in a very different way. Yeah, but don't fool yourself. This is hard, right? And that's part of the reason for many people, they choose to have a monastic life, to really give themselves a bit more space to really reflect on the practice. So most of us, I know, are not monks and nuns, so we'll have to reflect a little more. How can we find a way in our everyday lives of giving us what it takes to see the 3 marks without getting caught up too quickly in the passions of our life? But there's also this idea that renunciation happens naturally through our life. Right? So as children, perhaps we love sandcastles. Then we grow. As teenagers, maybe we like skateboards. And by that stage, we've lost interest in the sandcastle. Now what matters is the skateboard. Yeah, we become adults, and then our interest is our houses, our jobs, our careers, our cars. Eventually we retire, and as we grow older, perhaps what we're left with is an interest in things like, as Rinpoche says, lace tablecloths, salt shakers. We're definitely not attached to the skateboard. Spontaneous renunciation. And we know this is going to happen if we think about it. We talked in the first week about purpose, the regrets of the dying. Is there a way we can cultivate this awareness and act upon it without having to wait to grow old? Well, yes. Yeah, we can observe the 3 marks. We can familiarize ourselves with them. We can understand impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, non-self, and change our habitual way of relating to ourselves and to others. And once we know the truth, that is a form of liberation, right? Just like the parents with the sandcastle. We talked last week about a child watching a demon dance. The child is scared, but when they go behind the stage and see it's just a person wearing a mask, then that's the end of the demon. Another more familiar example, if you're having a nightmare, as soon as you know that you're just dreaming, it's finished, right? Even if you continue to dream, you're no longer caught. Indeed, you might even play with it, right? Lots of people love this idea of lucid dreaming. But until you know the truth, you're a victim of that game. So, yes, it's a big deal in one way, of course, knowing the truth. But it's also so simple in another way. And I think we'll go back and forth between appreciating how important and what a big deal this is, but also having confidence in the simplicity. Now, having both, though, can sometimes be a challenge. And I think it doesn't help when we hear words like nirvana. Right? I think that has so many connotations of rainbows and heavenly music playing. It damages this idea that the truth is just so ordinary. But as Rinpoche said, sometimes we need the hype, because too many of us haven't experienced the ordinariness of our lives. We haven't experienced normality. Right? This, we talked about the lettuce rather than the salad with the Thousand Island dressing. Right? The raw, uncooked, uncontrived nature. We don't really spend time with that. And unfortunately, we tend to think that seeing the truth is very profound, right? And we tend to say to ourselves, oh, well, I'm not profound, I'm just an ordinary person. But when we do that, we distance ourselves from the truth, because we distance ourselves from this thing we think is profound. It's not, right? It's the most ordinary thing. It's just we're not used to it. Now, yes, when we see it, it doesn't mean we're going to go to the mountains. It doesn't mean we're going to become renunciants. But it does change our attitude. How we see things will be different. Rinpoche likes to tell the story of his former secretary, who was a PhD biochemist. And she would always travel with lots of hand sanitizers and soap and disinfectants, because her training meant she would see germs everywhere. Right? And I think that's the kind of thing we're aiming for, right? We want to train our minds so that we see the three marks in all phenomena, and of course in ourselves. Yeah? That mindset of the sandcastle. If we can do that, we'll develop this attitude of less attachment, right? Less craving, less hope, less fear, more compassion. I do want to say, though, in passing, that this word non-self, right, the third of the three marks, the anatta in Pali, it's very difficult to translate properly, and it's often misunderstood as meaning non-selfish, right, as in generous. And partly, if you look at the English dictionary definitions, it really doesn't help, right? Because selfless means having no concern for the self, or unselfish, where unselfish is defined as generous. Even the word non-self is defined as material that is foreign to the body of an organism. Yeah, I mean, that's unfortunate, because in Buddhism, what we're really meaning is that there is no solid, unchanging core or identity. Right? Yourself is not a solid or fixed thing. It's not something that you can attach to, because there's no thing there. Right? You're dependent. You're part of the world around you. It's all part of a process, a system, a matrix. In week 6, we'll talk about how nothing is the way it appears. Everything is illusion. But actually, if you can understand that yourself is not a fixed, independent thing, if you reflect on that, perhaps a little bit like this idea of noticing what is your breath, what is not your breath, etc., you'll start to understand interdependence, right? You'll start to see the people around you matter. The world around you matters. Now, you'll naturally care more about ecology, about other people, about animals, right? About the impacts you create on the world, both positive and negative. You'll care more about the products you buy. Where did they come from? How were they made? How were people treated? When you dispose of them, what will happen? Will they be reused, recycled? You'll start to think in a much more systematic, interdependent way. Right? For many of us, we're still caught in this idea of this sort of self, this isolated self at the center of its own universe. So one other thought then, just before the break, talking about practice, right, and getting used to the truth. And again, unfortunately, the word meditation has this idea of sitting straight, maybe doing some kind of practice as we just did. But one of the important words, actually there's many words in Pali and Sanskrit, but one of the words means getting used to, right? Bhavana, or gom in Tibetan. For example, learning to drive, right? We go to a driving school, we learn the techniques, and we can't stay in the school our whole lives, so we have to go to the streets. We see cats and dogs running everywhere, we see the other traffic. And once we learn how to drive, then of course, if we want, we can text, we can fix our lipstick, we can turn around and chat to people in the back seat. Not that I'd recommend any of that. But just to say, we have a mastery of the technique, right? We've become familiar with it. We've internalized it. It's become part of us. That's the sort of thing that we want with our approach to the Buddhist view, right? There's another story about Picasso. He was sitting in a park sketching, and a woman walked by, recognized him, and went up to him and pleaded with him to draw her portrait. He was in a good mood, so he agreed, sketched, and a few minutes later handed it to her. She was ecstatic. She gushed about how wonderfully it captured the very essence of her character, how beautiful it was. And she asked, "How much do I owe you?" He said, $5,000. And she was taken aback, outraged, asked, "How is that even possible? It only took you 5 minutes." And he looked up, and without missing a beat, he said, "No, madam, that took me my whole life." Yeah, so the English word meditation, it doesn't convey this process of familiarization, of training, of mastery. And you'll often hear Buddhists term themselves practitioners, right? This idea that we are works in progress, that we see our life as ongoing practice. Yeah, we acknowledge that it's not going to be solved so quickly. And Vipassana is not necessarily just meditation, right? Because it's about seeing the truth. So it could be studying or contemplating a book. Could be a discussion with friends. Anything basically that pulls the rug from under your feet, challenges your existing habits and ways of seeing. Right? Anything that's against the 3 marks, right? Against seeing things as impermanent, unsatisfactory, and non-self. Basically, Vipassana is any study, any practice that brings you closer to the truth. And of course, traditional practices can be Vipassana, right? You can offer incense, you can offer a flower, offer a butter lamp. And if you're doing that with the awareness of the 3 marks, or at least the motivation to see the 3 marks, then that counts as practice. So with that, you can, of course, burn incense, go to the temple, shave your head, whatever. And we can do it in our everyday life, of course. But masters do still encourage us, perhaps to go out of the kitchen and into a special space, maybe a shrine room if we have one, or at least a little corner of the living room. Maybe from our house to the mountains, from the city to under a tree in the forest. And we're more likely to get closer to the truth if we're sitting straight rather than lying in the hammock sipping on a tequila. Also because practically it'll challenge our habitual thinking and associations, right? We don't associate lying in a hammock with seeing the truth. But not to say we can't, right? It really is about being able to match the practice and its demands with the current level of our training, our mind. We'll talk about this much more in future weeks when we talk about practice. But just to say, rituals also can help, right? They provide structure. Because once you have a ritual memorized, once you have it as part of your unconscious memory, it frees up your mind to not have to focus on the task, right? And then you can observe the nature of the task. You can observe your awareness as you are carrying out the task. Right? Like mastery in any domain is like this. If you want to play the piano, you keep practicing your scales. You practice a piece until the technique is no longer the issue. Right? You're free to focus on the expression, the interpretation. In martial arts, right, the colored belts come first, where you learn technique, but then the black belts are around mastery and awareness, presence, expression. Right? It is said the Shodan, first degree black belt, is not the end of training, but rather a beginning to advanced learning. The individual now knows how to walk and may thus begin the journey. Going back to the driving example, as a beginner, you're so focused on the technique of driving, changing gears, using the brake, using the accelerator. All of your conscious awareness is going into that. And if you remember the first few weeks as a new driver, it's very stressful. You haven't yet been able to internalize it. The expertise is not yet unconscious. You can't enjoy driving yet. But if you keep practicing, then you will. And it's the same with our Buddhist practice. So we should have this aspiration that practice can be everywhere, all the time. Because it's a motivation. It's an attitude. You can do it everywhere. I mean, you've got a motivation, you've got an attitude all the time anyway. It's just most of the time you're not aware of it. You're not mindful. Yeah? Now you have a chance to become aware and actually choose your motivation, choose your attitude, choose to be mindful of the three marks. And it won't come naturally at first, right? It is unnatural, it is unfamiliar. As we said, it'll feel wrong at the beginning, like anything that's new. But you don't have to quit your job. You can start right now. You don't need to make excuses about not having time or money to practice. You don't need an app. You don't even need a cushion. You don't need to set time aside. You don't need lots of hours sitting or chanting mantras. It's everywhere all the time. You could even be doing it right now as you listen to me. You could notice, this is impermanent. This is not 100% satisfying. There's no truly existing self or core or identity to me, to you, to these teachings. Just remember the sandcastle. And as Rinpoche said, a lot of the time the reason we don't practice is because we make practice into this big and complicated thing. We don't realize what practice actually is. If we just understood that it's paying attention to what's happening right now, with this attitude of seeing the truth, seeing its true nature, that's practice, right? You can do it while chopping onions. You can do it while having an argument with your partner. Nevertheless, yes, the sheer busyness and flux of life can be overwhelming, so it can be helpful to deliberately simplify your environment, to just focus more explicitly on this experience. So we'll talk about this more in future sessions. But for now, we're now going to take a 10-minute break. If any of you do have questions, the questions are open. The link is on the page in the website. Please submit your questions. Otherwise, I'll see you in 10 minutes. So welcome back. Some of you asked, what was that music? That's Schumann's A Fantasy in C, played by the Korean pianist Yeol Son. Okay, so continuing with view. And I just want to, as Rinpoche did, take a step back and pause to reflect on how Buddhism is seen a little differently in the modern world, right? I think as the John Kabat-Zinn quote made us see, a lot of people want to distance themselves from what they see as its religious aspects. They get caught up in seeing practice, malas, incense, artworks, stories. And I think as Buddhism has gone around the world and been absorbed into different cultures, it's picked up different language, different concepts from other systems. And now, of course, in the US and the modern world, it's very much absorbing a psychology and therapy, right? Just as it absorbed Taoism and Confucianism when it first went to China. As Rinpoche said, caring for one's elders is wonderful, but it isn't anything specifically to do with Buddhism. And yet in China, if they ask for the qualities of a good Buddhist, they'd include things like that. I think we're seeing something similar happen now in North America, where we're imbuing Buddhism with psychological concepts to determine what's good about it. I think that's actually misleading us quite a lot. Language is a challenge also, right? Even words like good, it's so influenced by our Abrahamic culture. Sanskrit, Pali, and Tibetan doesn't have the same connotations of right and wrong, morality, good and bad, the dualism that comes with a Judeo-Christian way of thinking. So it's almost impossible for us to undo that because we're in it, like the David Foster Wallace, this is water, we're swimming amidst it. I'm sure I gave another example of how Netflix, Game of Thrones is creating a globalized culture. He had a woman, a student of his, whose child wanted a dragon, and she offered him a Chinese dragon, a traditional, important symbol in Chinese culture, and he couldn't relate to it or understand it. He wanted a Disney dragon. So this is the danger, right? So somehow we have to be open-minded as we study and practice Buddhism. We have to know that we're learning about a non-dual system with our very dualistic language and culture, right? It's hard to step outside our ideas of good and bad, right and wrong, right? So if we can't do that, at least be aware that our language constrains us. Okay, so the framework for thinking about path is view, meditation, action, and result. Rinpoche talked about this extensively in Sydney in the beginning of 2020. And the result we've talked about already last week, right? It's not something to get or to attain. You already have it, right? But right at the moment, it's like your window is covered with dirt. So your job is to get rid of the dirt, the delusion, the ignorance. And we talk about being awakened, but that's dispelling the ignorance of sleep. So that's the result. And then the path to get to that result has these three essential elements of view, meditation, and action. Right, so the view, and we're going to talk about that now, it's a way of seeing, it's an attitude. Of course, you ideally want your view to be aligned with reality, in other words, the true nature of phenomena and self. Meditation, then, is to familiarize yourself with that view, right? Like the driving lessons we talked about. And finally, action, then, is once you have internalized the view, then you can act spontaneously. So what does it mean to have a view? I like this story. So Shoe Factory sent 2 marketing scouts to a region of Africa to study the prospects for expanding the business. The first sent back a telegram saying, "Situation hopeless, stop. No one wears shoes." The other writes back triumphantly, "Glorious business opportunity, stop. They have no shoes." Yeah, so same Same conditions, same reality, very different experience, very different attitude, framed by a very different view. Okay, one of the most famous examples, Shakespeare, Hamlet, Act 2, Scene 2, where his friends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern arrive, and he says, "What have you, my good friends, deserved at the hands of fortune that she sends you to prison hither?" "Prison, my lord? Denmark's a prison. Then is the world one? A goodly one, in which there are many confines, wards, and dungeons, Denmark being one of the worst." "We think not so, my lord." "Why then, 'tis none to you, for there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. To me, it is a prison." Okay, it's a very famous example. Yeah, nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So that is view. Some dictionary definitions, I just looked it up, because there's a couple of words that can be used somewhat interchangeably. It's a view, mindset, attitude. So view is defined as a particular way of considering or regarding something, an attitude or opinion. Also, the extent or range of vision, a mode or manner of looking at or regarding something, an opinion or judgment colored by the feeling or bias of its holder. Mindset is the established set of attitudes held by someone, also a mental attitude or inclination. And then attitude is a subtle way of thinking or feeling about someone or something, typically one that is reflected in a person's behavior. Right, so I think these definitions make it clear. A view isn't truth, but rather a way of seeing, a way of understanding that is colored by cognitive distortions, emotional distortions. All right, that's also the Buddhist understanding of view. And views are also partial, right? There's a famous story, actually it's a Buddhist story, The 6 Blind Men and the Elephant, you may know this. A group of blind men heard that a strange animal called an elephant had been brought into town, but none of them were aware of its shape and form. Out of curiosity, they said, "We must inspect and know it by touch, of which we are capable." So they sought it out, and when they found it, they groped about it. The first person, whose hand landed on the trunk, said, "This being is like a thick snake." For another one, whose hand reached its ear, it seemed like a kind of fan. As for another person, whose hand was upon its leg, "The elephant is a pillar like a tree trunk." The blind man who placed his hand upon its side said the elephant is a wall. Another who felt its tail described it as a rope. The last felt its tusk, stating the elephant is that which is hard, smooth, and like a spear. Okay, so I think we all understand what that's pointing us towards, right? And actually, even one of our supposedly most rational sciences, like economics, ever since the work of Daniel Kahneman, now we realize even in economics, even in supposedly rational decision-making, we have cognitive bias. Right? A couple of the classic examples are things like sunk cost. Right? We have deep-seated biases to make choices in a way that justifies our past choices. Anchoring. Our minds give disproportionate weight to the first information they receive. So people use that in negotiations all the time, right? Status quo. We display strong bias towards alternatives that perpetuate the status quo. Confirmation bias. We seek information that supports our existing instinct or point of view while avoiding information that contradicts it. Availability. We pay attention to the data that's readily available rather than the data that's actually necessary to make a good decision. Sometimes said we look for our lost keys under the street lamp where there's light, even if we dropped our keys somewhere in the shade. Yes, I am offering all these examples because I'm trying to help you loosen your grip on your current view, right? Your current way of constructing reality. Remember, as we said, in Vipassana, we're trying to see the truth, which means pulling the rug out from under our feet, because our current way of constructing reality, we're not seeing the truth, and that's why we're suffering. Yeah? Our current views are leading to ego clinging, craving, hope and fear, and suffering. And actually, this idea of changing our view in order to then change our attitude and our behavior it's very much the same approach that is used within cognitive psychology, right, and even cognitive behavioral therapy. So this idea of cognitive distortions was first noted by Aaron Beck in his research with depressed patients in the 60s. And he gave an example, one good example of cognitive distortion is what he calls selective abstraction, where we focus on one detail, often out of context, and ignore the other more important parts of an experience. For example, a woman, Jenny, was delivering some teaching at her workplace and got a round of applause at the end, as well as numerous colleagues telling her how well she did and how helpful they found her presentation. But when she looked at the feedback forms afterwards, one form had critical comments and a poor rating. She couldn't stop thinking about this one piece of negative feedback and criticized herself, saying, "I'm such a rubbish teacher." As a result, she felt awful. Her thinking process was distorted because she had managed to ignore all of the positive feedback she'd received and focus solely on the negative. She did this automatically and without realizing she'd done it. Yeah. So this is a very familiar kind of example that a cognitive therapist will work on. And it's the kind of thing we're trying to draw our attention to in the Dharma path also. And actually, when you look at the treatment in cognitive behavioral therapy, it actually also sounds a little bit like the Dharma path, right? Because a therapist first will try to help the client understand about the idea that there are such things as automatic thoughts. Right? They'll introduce them to this concept that there is a view, there are distortions, just as we have done. Then they'll help the client understand and notice their cognitive biases. And with us, right, we practice Vipassana. We develop awareness of the body, the breath, other phenomena, which we'll come to. We notice our own biases where we don't see the three marks. Right? In CBT, you do cognitive restructuring. Right, challenging the content of negative automatic thoughts. Right, that's a mainstay of CBT. Same thing we do, right? We challenge our wrong views. We spend a lot of time in Buddhist philosophy establishing the right view and demonstrating why other views are false. In fact, that's another thing in CBT also, right? Traditional disputation, right? Where they examine the evidence for and against a thought. Because clients often find it easy to generate reasons why a particular thought is true and may need assistance to consider reasons why it might not be 100% true all of the time. Yeah? And so once you've got some evidence to show why an automatic thought may not always be true, then you can become more balanced, right, to account for all of the evidence. And then the final step would be making the restructured thinking habitual, same as the Buddhist approach. So yes, in many ways, we could say Buddhism agrees with cognitive therapy. We could even say cognitive therapy is a form of Buddhism in some ways. Except in Buddhism, we're not just stopping with these automatic thoughts and stories about the self. We're looking at the underlying nature of self, the nature of reality, right? The very idea of having a fixed self, the very idea of ego clinging. Yeah, I saw Sarah in the chat asked me to say a little more about non-self, anatta. We can come back to that. We will come back to that much more in week 6, but we can talk more in the questions and answers also if you like. And just to say, right, because, like in cognitive therapy, these thoughts for us in Buddhism, they're so automatic, we don't even notice that we're deceiving ourselves. Right? So we need a healthy respect for our self-deception. As Milarepa said, my practice is not deceiving myself. The Nobel physicist said, Richard Feynman, he said, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. And George Orwell, he said, to see what is in front of one's nose needs a constant struggle. So let's continue to loosen our grip a little on our current view. Just this idea that appearances are not reality, right? Seeing, Vipassana, is not the same as Vipassana, of seeing the truth, seeing the nature of reality. So let's start with science, right? There's a classic 1953 experiment looking at how a frog's eye can only perceive 4 types of phenomena. First is clear lines of contrast. Second is sudden changes in illumination. Third is outlines in motion. And fourth is curves of outlines of small, dark objects. Right? A frog doesn't see its mother's face. It certainly can't appreciate a sunset, can't even appreciate the nuances of color. It only sees what it needs in order to eat and avoid being eaten. Right? Small, tasty bugs, or things like a stork coming in its direction. The frog's eye only delivers very selective information to the frog's brain. Right? It only perceives that which has been hardwired. Human eyes are also selective, though much more complex than a frog, right? We think we see everything until we remember that bees can see patterns in ultraviolet light and flowers. Owls can see in the dark. Other species can hear things we can't hear. Insects can pick up molecular traces from hundreds of feet away where they're potential mates. We, like the frogs, only perceive what we have been evolved, right? Programmed to receive. And our awareness is further restricted by the fact that we can only recognize things that we have mental maps or categories for. So we don't see reality, right? So what then is reality? And this question of appearance versus reality has really been a concern of philosophy since the beginning, both in the West and in the East. So Plato had the famous allegory of the cave, right, where he begins by having Socrates ask Glaucon to imagine a cave where people have been imprisoned from childhood, but not from birth. These prisoners are chained, so their legs and necks are fixed, forcing them to gaze at the wall in front of them and not to look around the cave, each other or themselves. Behind the prisoners is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners is a raised walkway with a low wall, behind which people walk carrying objects or puppets of men and other living things. The people walk behind the wall so their bodies don't cast shadows for the prisoners to see, but the objects they carry do. Just as the puppet showmen have screens in front of them at which they work their puppets. The prisoners cannot see any of what's happening behind them. They're only able to see the shadows cast upon the cave wall in front of them. The sounds of people talking echo off the walls, and the prisoners believe these sounds come from the shadows. Socrates suggests the shadows are reality for these prisoners, because they've never seen anything else. Nor do they realize that what they see are shadows of objects in front of a fire. Much less that these objects are inspired by real things outside the cave, which they do not see. He says few humans will ever escape the cave. It's not some easy task, and only a true philosopher with decades of preparation will be able to leave up the steep incline. Most humans still live at the bottom of the cave, and a small few will be the major artists that project the shadows with the use of human-made light. Okay, so that's Plato, the roots of Western philosophy. Okay, what about the East? So, from Taoism, lovely story, Zhuangzi and the butterfly. This is from the 3rd century BCE. Once Zhuangzi dreamed he was a butterfly flitting and fluttering about, happy with himself and doing as he pleased. He didn't know that he was Zhuangzi. Suddenly he woke up, and there he was, solid and unmistakable Zhuangzi. But he didn't know if he was Zhuangzi who had dreamt he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that he was Zhuangzi. Between Zhuangzi and the butterfly there must be some distinction. This is called the transformation of things. And actually, even in, not just philosophy, but in religion, I mean, you have this idea of the truth being so important. I mean, one of the most famous Christian sayings is, "The truth will set you free." From verse 832 of the Gospel of John, where Jesus is addressing a group of Jews who believed in him. Likewise in Hinduism, right? The truth is defined as that which is unchangeable, has no distortion, beyond the distinctions of time and space and person, that which pervades the universe in all its constancy. And there are many explanations of truth by Hindu philosophers, such as the national motto of India, which is Satyameva Jayate, right? Truth alone wins. But also Satyam Muktaye, truth liberates. So The face of truth is covered by a golden bowl. Unveil it, O Pushan, the sun, so that I who have truth as my duty may see it. Yeah, so that's from the Upanishads. And likewise in Buddhism, yeah, in all of the yanas, especially Theravada, Mahayana, prajna, or wisdom, right, insight, is seeing the true nature of the person, of the mind, of phenomena. And the final and complete realization of this nature is considered awakening or enlightenment. As we said last week, another way of relating to the Tathagata or the Buddha is right view. And just to repeat, as Buddhists, when we talk about right view, it's not about having a set of beliefs, because we want to shrug off all our views and beliefs. They're all dirt on the window. And I'm not saying this is how a Buddhist would frame it, but I always liked Aldous Huxley's quote from when he wrote his book, Doors of Perception. It was a book of his psychedelic experiences under the influence of mescaline. And he quoted from William Blake, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up, till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. It's interesting, isn't it? I think this analogy, this example of the cave, the cavern, how we limit ourselves. So, yeah, I mean, as Rinpoche said, another way of framing what do Buddhists believe? Well, we believe if you have a wrong view or a partial view, then you will suffer. And so as Shantideva, the Buddhist Mahayana master, said, you are nevertheless allowed one ignorance for the time being, namely thinking there is enlightenment. Why? Because you have suffering, you have dissatisfaction, and you have to shrug off this dissatisfaction, so you need a path. And to cross the river, to get to the other shore, right, you need a boat, you need a path, you need a view, meditation and action. So you start with the wrong view, you then go with the right view, right, the view of the path, and then you end up on the other side with no view. But if you try and reject the view of the path too quickly, it's like rejecting your boat, right? Then you can't cross the river. Yeah, so we do need a right view while we're practicing the path, even though at the end our aim is to be rid of all views. I just wanted to also read something Rinpoche wrote in actually 1999 on life as cinema, because, as you know, he makes movies as well, and he's often used the analogy for how the projection of a movie is so similar to the way that our mind projects, right? This idea of view has a lot in common with movies. He said, and I'm struck actually when I read this, how similar this is to Plato's allegory. He said, just suppose that we've been born in a cinema hall. We don't know that what's going on in front of us is just a production. We don't know it's just a film, just a movie, and the events in the movie aren't real, that they have no true existence. Everything we see on the screen, love, hate, violence, suspense, thrills, is in fact just the effect of light projected through celluloid. But nobody's ever told us this, so we just sit there watching, fixated on the film. If someone tries to attract our attention, we say, shut up. Even if we have something important to do, we don't want to do it. We're completely engrossed and blind to the fact that this projection is completely futile. Now suppose there's someone in the seat next to us who says, look, this is just a film, it's not real, this isn't really happening, it's just a projection. There's a chance we too might understand that what we're seeing is in fact a movie, that it is unreal and essenceless. This doesn't automatically mean we get up and leave the cinema. We don't have to do that. We can just relax and simply watch the love affair, the crime thriller, or whatever. We can experience its intensity. And if we have a certain confidence that this is just a projection, then we can rewind, fast forward, or play the film again as we like. And we have the choice to leave whenever we like, and to come back at another time to watch again. And once we're certain that we can leave any time we like, we may not feel compelled to do so. We can choose to sit comfortably and watch. And sometimes a sequence in the movie can overwhelm our emotions. A tragic moment might hit our soft spot and we're carried away. But now, something in our heart's telling us that we know it's not real. It's not a big deal. This is what the Dharma practitioner needs to understand. That the whole of samsara, or nirvana is as essenceless or untrue as that film. Until we see this, it will be very difficult for the Dharma to sink into our minds. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit then about how does this process then of learning to see the truth, how does it actually work? And we've talked a little bit in the past about the way of the Mahasiddhas, right? The great yogis and meditators of the non-dual tradition. So just talk a little more about that. So let's go back to the experience of the tail, right? We have this experience of the tail. Imagine we've taken some hallucinogenic substance and we're anxious, we're panicking, we have things to do, we've got places to go, people to see. We don't like this idea. We have a tail sprouting out from our behind. But the wind then slams the door suddenly, perhaps, or the phone rings, and suddenly we come back to the truth. Maybe this hallucinogen hasn't worn off fully yet, so we can still experience this tail, but now we might think, oh, maybe it's not actually happening. Maybe we can feel behind us and there is no tail there. Now, how did we get there? Yes, the wind slammed a door. There was no words, no language. Sometimes we might call this kind of thing a blessing, right? Rinpoche said amazing things can happen if you have the right causes and conditions, like the stories of Naropa and Saraha we had last week. Even in the Mahayana there are teachings like this, right, where Buddha picked up a lotus and smiled, and his disciple Kashyapa got it, right? He understood. Likewise in Zen, also a Mahayana path, there are methods like koan, paradox, like the sound of one hand. And people can get it, right, without words. If you've got the right faculties, you can even get it by watching a leaf falling or by watching the sunset. Yes, you maybe are touched by impermanence, essencelessness. And equally, right, you could have a couple much in love, reminded of Shakespeare's sonnet, right, watching the sunset, having the exact opposite experience, deepening their clinging, deepening their attachment because of this same sunset. Yeah, so again, a reminder, it's not this kind of, seeing the truth, this shift in attitude. It's nothing mystical, it's not a spiritual experience, it's just a shift in the way we see, a shift in view, a shift in values. And like the sandcastle, it can dent our organized, sensible, everyday life. And that's it, right? If it can be that we may never go back. And that's wonderful if we are able to have those kinds of experiences, but it's not, for many of us, very reliable. I think for most of us, the path of hearing and contemplation and meditation, the path of language is necessary. If somebody has to say, can you feel the tail behind you? If not, don't you think it means maybe you don't have a tail? Right? That kind of limited logic, that can actually work. But all of this is hard, as we said, to accept emotionally, right? Our habits are so strong. All that we buy, all that we possess, our jobs, the economy, money, materialism, consumerism, right? It all goes against that, right? The world of advertising wants us to believe that we are defined by the things that we do and don't have. And so many of us, unfortunately, now believe that. So just this idea then of transformation. I hope I've given you a bit of a sense that we need to not take our view for granted, but I also want you to not take for granted that it's going to be easy to change. And so Thomas Kuhn, who was a famous philosopher of science, wrote this wonderful book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he was talking about how even in the world of science, a change in paradigm, a change in view is so difficult. So he says, you can have two groups of scientists practicing in different worlds, and they see different things when they look from the same point in the same direction. It's not to say they can see anything they please. They're both looking at the world, and what they look at has not changed. But in some areas, they see different things, and they see them in different relation, one to the other. That's why a law that cannot even be demonstrated to one group of scientists may occasionally seem intuitively obvious to another. Equally, it's why, before they can hope to communicate fully, one group or the other must experience the conversion that we've been calling a paradigm shift. And because it's a transition between incommensurables, the transition between competing paradigms cannot be made a step at a time, forced by logic and neutral experience. Like a Gestalt switch, it must occur all at once, although not necessarily in an instant, or not at all. Yeah, so very similar to how if we practice, we will have these shifts in our understanding of Vipassana, right? It really is a shift in our paradigm about the nature of the self, the nature of the world. Yeah, so Kuhn continues. He says, how then are scientists brought to make this transposition? Part of the answer is they are very often not. Copernicanism made few converts for almost a century after Copernicus's death. Newton's work was not generally accepted, particularly on the continent, for more than half a century after the Principia appeared. Priestley never accepted the oxygen theory, nor Lord Kelvin the electromagnetic theory, and so on. The difficulties of conversion have often been noted by scientists themselves. Darwin, in a particularly perceptive passage at the end of his Origin of Species, wrote, "Although I'm fully convinced of the truth of views given in this volume, I by no means expect to convince experienced naturalists whose minds are stocked with a multitude of facts, all viewed during a long course of years from a point of view directly opposite to mine. But I look with confidence to the future, to young and rising naturalists who will be able to view both sides of the question with impartiality." Max Planck, surveying his own career in his autobiography, sadly remarked that a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. Yeah, I find that last one quite profound, actually. Obviously, we sincerely hope that we can see the truth more quickly than that. Yeah, but just to say, this is even in science, right, where people are working with experimental procedure, with evidence, with objective reality, and still convincing people is so hard, right? In our everyday worlds, where there's so much emotion and intuition, we live in this world of fake news and, social media and all the rest, how much harder to get us to see the truth, right? Yeah, I wanted to share another story, one of my favorites actually. So this is about Stravinsky's ballet score, The Rite of Spring. Right? It's a ballet and orchestral concert work by the Russian composer Igor Stravinsky, written for the 1913 Paris season of Sergei Diaghilev's Ballet Russe company. And it was first performed at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées on 29th of May 1913. But the avant-garde nature of the music and choreography caused a sensation. Right? Many called the first night reaction a riot or a near riot. The disturbances in the audience began during the introduction and grew noisier when the curtain rose on the stamping dancers in the augurs of spring. And Stravinsky wrote in his autobiography that the derisive laughter that greeted the first bars of the introduction disgusted him, and he left the auditorium to watch the rest of the performance from the stage wings. The demonstrations, he said, grew into a terrific uproar, which, along with the on-stage noises, drowned out the voice of Nijinsky, who was shouting the step numbers to the dancers. The journalist and photographer Karl van Vechten, who was in the audience, he claimed in his book, Music After the Great War, that the person sitting behind him got so carried away with the excitement of the music and the dance that he began to beat rhythmically on top of my head with his fists. Just to give you a sense, right? And at that time, a Parisian ballet audience typically consisted of two diverse groups, right? It was the wealthy and fashionable set, who would expect a traditional performance with beautiful music, and then a bohemian group, who, as the poet-philosopher Jean Cocteau asserted, would acclaim, right or wrong, anything that is new because of their hatred of the boxes. And several people felt that trouble began when these two factions began attacking each other. And their mutual anger was so strong, but it was soon diverted to the orchestra. Everything available was tossed in our direction, said the orchestra, but we continued to play on. I want to offer these stories just so we can appreciate the challenge of transformation, just how difficult it is. So the Buddhist view, it's not complicated, right? It's not intellectually hard to understand, but it's very different from anything else in samsara, right? It's very different from the way we've approached things in our lives until now. And it's very different from the views that are held by society in general, right? Especially as the world becomes ever more materialistic and consumerist. And it's not just that the view is unfamiliar, but we don't have all the sort of supporting systems in our lives to help us. If you look at social psychology and cognitive psychology, and you look at what it takes for a person to change their mind or sustain a set of habits, I mean, there needs to be a sense of understanding and conviction in the truth. But there's so little in our world where people are asking questions of this truth, the nature of reality. Right? As we saw with John Kabat-Zinn, these are deemed unscientific, they're avoided. And this is even by people teaching mindfulness, right? People who are trained as Buddhists themselves. Of course, the economic value is not at all clear. We're not sure there's any benefits to this. After all, if we all became comfortable with the 3 marks, who knows what would happen to the global economy? Right? Would we all want to spend as much time on Facebook to chase as many links with ads? Hard to know. And what about our role models, right? What examples do we have? How many people among our companions, right? The 5 closest people that influence us so much, how many of them are following this path? How many of them are thinking about the view in this way? And what about the way we're rewarded in our life? Also, a nice quote from Upton Sinclair where he said, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." There's very few systems of incentives in this world that are encouraging us to see the view. And finally, in terms of training, in terms of skills, in terms of basic capabilities, most of us have had no training in this, right? Our education systems don't teach us this. So really, the 3 jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, so valuable as a support to your practice. Okay, so let's take another moment then. Just to pay attention to what is happening for us right now, but maybe with this attitude of wanting to understand the 3 marks, perhaps even allowing us to see the nature of what is happening. Okay, so, I mean, if you've taken this hallucinogenic substance, right, you think you have a tail, you're worrying about how will you go to work tomorrow. If I were to say to you, calm down, don't worry, it's not necessarily very helpful. It's probably patronizing, even upsetting. I mean, I shouldn't even have to say anything about your tail because you don't even have one, right? So instead, the way the Buddhist path works is we say, maybe I offer you a glass of water, or maybe give you a hug, help to reduce the anxiety from this non-existent tail. Maybe I'll even say, hey, let me find you a new tailor. Maybe we can find a way to hide your tail. In other words, I'm going to go along with you, right? I'm going to entertain your hallucination. Ramsha gave the example, he said, look, back to the snake and the rope that we talked about before. If you've been to Africa and had a terrible snake experience, trauma, you don't think about a rope at all. All you can see is the snake, even though it's just a striped rope sitting in front of you. And if I were to come to you and wave a rope in front of your face saying, see, no snake, you probably just have a heart attack. It's not going to be helpful. You're much wiser to say, oh yes, I see. Let's see what we can do. Right? Play along with your experience. So we'll see this more in the following weeks, right? In Buddhism, yes, we want to see the truth, but that doesn't mean the path or even the teachings are going to present us with the raw truth directly, right? The emphasis, especially in the Mahayana, is on skillful means, right? It's on teaching the truth in a way that people can hear it, right? Giving them enough that they can keep practicing, keep moving forwards on their path, rather than turning away in despair or rejection. It's the same as in therapy, right? A therapist has to connect with the subjective experience of their client, even if they might think it's not true and not justified. When Rinpoche was teaching all of this in Sydney, he actually said, that's what I have to do now for these next 3 days. And I was quite struck by that he would, say so publicly. I remember actually many years ago when he was teaching in France, he'd been doing a session with a group of adults in the main teaching tent. And during the lunch break, he went outside, and there was a group of children outside, and he was teaching the children. And I was really struck that the way he was teaching the children was pretty much identical to the way he was teaching the adults. And I think I really realized, I think I had a sense that we were so sophisticated, so able to, hear the truth. And I think I realized that for many of us, including myself, we really need to be given a gradual path, right? We need to study, we need to practice, so that over time it can slowly start to permeate us. And if we're lucky, we won't have that kind of reaction that the audience had upon hearing Stravinsky, but maybe slowly but surely it will enter us, right? And it will transform us. But that will take time, that will take practice. So I think in summary, as Rinpoche said, we fear the snake, and somehow our teachers have to tell us that there is no snake. But we can't digest that right away. As we keep seeing the snake, especially when the light is dim, so they have to keep telling you. And that is the path. Okay, so with that, I shall bid you farewell for this week. If you're staying for the questions, I'll see you in 10 minutes. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. Okay, so welcome back for the questions and answers. I think I'd like to start with Sarah's question, which is in the chat. She said, please could you say more about the translation of no self? She clarified how the translation of non-self can lead to the potential misunderstanding of not being selfish. Yeah. Well, I think there's two different words in English, right? Because often for anatta, right, which literally, if you look at this, the Pali or the Sanskrit, the atta or atman is the word for self, yeah, and so an is then the negative. So anatta means literally no self, right? And the atman, yes, it means self. It also means something like an essence or a core or a soul. I mean, there's a big debate in ancient Indian philosophy, including between the Buddhists and the Hindus, about what it might mean. I think in the modern world, it's this notion, whatever we might want to call it, we all identify with some core element of who we are, right? This idea of a solid self. So whatever we want to call that thing, that's the thing. Then the third mark we're trying to challenge, right? So anatta means non-self. But I think the reason it's often translated as non-self rather than no self is because it's back to the example of the snake and the rope, right? So recall, the snake and the rope is where we're in a dark room, there's a rope on the floor, and we misperceive it as a snake, right? We turn the light on, we realize it wasn't a snake, it's actually a rope. So the translation is not no snake, even though that's technically correct, because we're not denying or refuting a snake. There is no snake, right? It's non-snake, right? And I think it's the same idea of self. We see a self like we see a mirage in a desert, right? And we'll talk more about this in week 6. Right? It's an appearance that has no basis, right? It has no foundation. And so in Buddhism, we're trying not to get you to deny it, because also, as an appearance, there clearly is a self, right? We go through the life. We wake up yesterday with the same job, the same partner, the same house that we had today, right? So there is a sense of continuity, right? Which is conventionally what we mean by self. And in fact, the word self has a lot of connection with the word person, which actually is a word which we use to talk about like a legal responsibility and accountability, right, for rights and responsibilities of a person. But self then, back to non-self, what I was saying is typically the challenge comes when we translate anatta into English, because if you do it literally, you'd either say no self or non-self. And I think a lot of people also like the word selfless, right? Because you can see why that would be similar. So as I said, the problem is, if you look in the dictionary, selfless has the meaning of no concern for the self, right? Unselfish or generous, right? So, which of course is a wonderful thing. And yes, we practice generosity in the Buddhist path too, but that's not what we mean by anatta. Right? And likewise, the translation non-self, it's more, the example that Merriam-Webster gives is material that is foreign to the body of an organism, right? So we can distinguish what is self and what is non-self. It's a little bit like saying, if we have a disease, our immune system sees that as non-self. And part of what makes the immune system so magical is it can differentiate between our own body cells and the cells that are not part of our self, right? And so when you have, for those of us who have immune system disorders, right, or autoimmune diseases, that's when that ability to distinguish self and non-self breaks down. Yeah. So the word in English tends to be used in that kind of context, right? Somewhat more biological in its nature, right? So differentiate what is part of us and what is not part of us. But it's still being used very, very differently from the Buddhist idea of anatta, because even then, non-self, in the biological sense, still holds to the idea that there is a self, right? There is a biological core, and all this other stuff is not part of it. Yeah, so I hope that makes sense. So on to the questions. First, from Lydia, she asks, if the self doesn't exist, then does the clinging to a non-existent self exist? Well, I mean, yes, that's why we suffer. Again, it doesn't truly exist, because in Buddhism, true existence means that it has this ultimate unchangeable status. And if that were the case, then ignorance would be permanent, right? There would be no possibility of enlightenment. So, yes, there is clinging to a non-existent self, but it's very similar to clinging to the idea of the snake, or seeing the demon before we realize it's just a man wearing a mask, right? So there's clinging as long as there is ignorance, but remember, the ignorance is like the dirt on the window, and we can clean the dirt. Okay, next part of your question is, but since this all apparently exists while not truly, where is this happening? Is it happening somewhere? And gosh, that's a big question. I mean, I think we would again have to differentiate between mind and nature of mind, or cognizance. I think at the level of mind, yes, it's happening in your brain, of course. I think at the level of, the nature of mind, the hard problem is consciousness a property of the material body, or is it something else? I think it's fair to say scientists haven't concluded an answer on that question. Right? There are different arguments in both directions. Some would say it's all explicable perfectly simply within materialist paradigm. Others say, no, we need to have a universe which has some kind of consciousness as a primal element, just like matter or energy. Often that view is called panpsychism. Third part of the question. My relationship with my mother is getting so fraught with no end in sight. I just want whatever this is to stop as soon as possible. The unhappiness and the desire not to see her in anguish makes me want to cut through it and see it in terms of what's really happening rather than only what's apparently happening. So to the best of my ability, I apply the view that it's all just a magic show. She's the magic show, I'm the magic show, and there is a backstage somewhere putting on this show that isn't real. But you further mentioned that for the Buddha there is no show, no audience. For him nothing has happened. I find this aspect of the view harder to apply. Can you elaborate? Yeah, well, it's again tricky also. The idea of seeing things from the Buddhist perspective, I mean, the best I can offer would be to say it's like the waves and the ocean. I mean, if you're, if you're a sailor in a boat, then you can see the waves. But if you're the ocean, then you don't see the waves as waves. It's all part of ocean. It's kind of a bad example, but the point is, for the Buddha, there is no phenomena that can be separated out from the ongoing flux of reality. There is, it's non-dual, so there is no subject, there is no object, right? There's no audience as subject, there's no show as object. And therefore we can't even say there is anything happening per se. The idea of something happening is itself a very dualistic framing, where there is a subject, an object, and an action. And very hard for us to step outside that and imagine what would a non-dual perspective be. I think that for now I'll just leave it and say we'll come back to this in week 6. So continue to let this question trouble you, and let's see if we can get any closer then. Next question from Elder. He says, is cannabis detrimental to the practice? In which ways? And he says, I'm asking from a technical point of view, not a moralistic point of view. So Elder, I'm not sure when you say technical if you mean kind of biological, physiological, or whether you mean from a Dharma practice point of view. I mean, I'm not going to attempt a physiological answer because I think you can look that up yourself. I think, the physiological effects of cannabis are easy to read about and understand, for good and, of course, for evil. I actually know someone who took too much cannabis and had a severe schizophrenic breakdown afterwards. So, and I know that can happen also. But in terms of, I think, what I think you're asking, which is, how does it help or hinder your Dharma practice? I think, well, firstly, I would say it really depends what vehicle, what yana of Buddhism you're practicing, right? Because in the Theravada, there's pretty strict discipline, even in the 5 vows, about not to take intoxicants. Yeah, because it's hard enough, as we hopefully saw today, to see the 3 marks even at the best of times, right? When we're non-distracted, where our environment is quite clear, there's not too much going on. And if you start to drink, if you start to do drugs, your ability to maintain that kind of awareness, that kind of observer, that's going to be more difficult, right? Having said that, in the Vajrayana, the relationship is very different, right? Because there are many stories of the great masters who would deliberately take on substances, psychedelics, alcohol, whatever, as a way of distorting their mind and their emotions, but with the ability to observe the distortion. Yeah, so that's a little different, because I think if you can do that, and of course I will caution all of us that very few of us can, then it's completely different, because then any of these substances can be part of your practice. They can help you realize how your ordinary perception is just one of many that your mind can produce, right? And I think that was very much behind that wonderful Aldous Huxley quote I gave, The Doors of Perception. Yeah, I think a lot of people who are studying psychedelics, I think Michael Pollan's lovely book, How to Change Your Mind, there is this sense of being really curious about the way that reality, as we saw today, is not some direct correspondence between what's out there and what's happening in our heads. Actually, there's all kinds of construction and creation and selective editing going on, right? It really is a virtual reality that our minds are producing for us, which has some resemblance and some connection to the world, but we certainly couldn't say it is reality. Yeah? So it can sometimes really help one's practice to mess with that projection, so to speak, as a way of becoming less attached to one's current projection. Yeah, I think a lot of people who take psychedelics will talk about the experiences they have and how many of them describe those experiences in very spiritual terms, about how they, saw their world, their life in a different way. And indeed, many of them came out of that with a desire to take up a spiritual practice. Yeah? Partly because, otherwise, if you can't generate this insight for yourself and you keep having to rely on external substances, well, that's obviously problematic, right? Much better if we can do practice and then carry the view, realize the view, have it with us all the time when we need it. Yeah, and if you do your Buddhist practice, that's, I think, a way of getting to the insight about the constructed nature of reality without having to go through drugs and so forth. So I think, in summary, Elder, what I would say is, I think whether it's good or whether it's bad, I can't answer, because it really depends on you and your capacities as a practitioner. It may be something excellent for you, and it may be something which is very bad for you, right? I guess just in passing, I would ask, why cannabis, right? Why are you turning to that? Is it some hack to solve a problem that maybe could or should be solved by Dharma practice? Is it some attempt to find a relief of some symptom? Is it actually helping you, right? Is it actually providing more of a forest glade environment for you to practice in? Or is it just allowing you to turn away from difficulties in your life? So I guess that's more for you to personally reflect on, and just, decide for yourself what feels right. And certainly, Elder, both for you and Lydia, for your question, I'm more than happy to talk about this with you personally if either of you would like to talk about your practice. Another question from Lydia. Rinpoche seems to encourage creativity in his projects related to education and the younger generation. I believe you also mentioned art in general as something that can be used as part of the path. Is there a relationship between creativity in terms of both art appreciation and art making and the non-dual view? Yeah, I would say definitely. Yeah, I think we've always in our relative world. I mean, back to the Stravinsky example of the Rite of Spring, right? Well, we had the Bohemians who welcomed new and challenging things, right? Whereas the upper classes wanted things that they were familiar, that were elegant, that were, kind of nice and gentle. I think a big part of the non-dual practice is the ability, as we've said a few times, to challenge ourselves, to pull the rug from under our feet, right? It involves thinking out of the box, right? It involves creativity in our approach to life. And I think artistic practice, and of course art in all its forms, is wonderful for giving us a different perspective, a different way of seeing the world, challenging our assumptions, challenging our framings. And I think that's true whether it's visual art, or literature or poetry, dance and music. I mean, all the arts can do this. So 100%, yeah, very much so. I'd really strongly encourage art in all its forms. And I think even traditionally, I mean, I think perhaps very well developed within the Chinese and Japanese forms of Buddhism, things like painting, calligraphy, drawing the enso, flower arranging, poetry, haiku. I mean, all these art forms are also forms of practice, yeah. And indeed, it's said that great calligraphy masters can see the state of your mind and your heart even by the form of your calligraphy. Yeah. Likewise in India and in Tibet, there's lots of great traditions of sacred dance, similar, where the way a person is able to express physically gives you insight into their minds and their hearts. And I think even in the Western tradition, right, I think with art, classical music, with all these things, I think if we know how to look, back to Vipassana, I think we can also see so much there. Elka's question. She says, so with the 3 marks in mind, is it helpful to view ourselves more as a kind of fluid or process rather than something static as we usually do? Definitely, Elka, yes. I would say the ideal is to go beyond any kind of narrative or story or view of yourself at all, right? That would be the best. But as we said, to cross the river, we need a boat, right? So I think starting to undo anything which is fixed and solid will really help. Yeah. So learning, I think as we said in previous weeks, right? Learning to see that the self is a work in progress, right? In other words, it is something fluid. It is a process. I mean, just that alone can really loosen things up. Yeah, the only reason I'm not 100% celebrating that idea is that unfortunately we can also then get attached to the fluidity or to the process itself, right? We may say even though it's not fixed, it's the process that I now identify with. So there can still be a form of identification taking place, right? It's a little bit like, the ancient Greek idea that, a man can never put his foot in the same river twice, because obviously the individual molecules of water are always going to be different. But, of course, we identify with a river, which is itself a fluid process. We identify with it as a thing, right? We give it a name, we know where it is. And so I think that the danger is the identification, right? So yes, if it helps you, Elka, to slowly but surely reduce your identification, I think it's wonderful. But best of all is to try and go beyond any kind of identification, hard though that is. Finally, there's a question here from Annie saying, how to overcome easily feeling tired when we open our eyes, when we practice awareness with open eyes? Yeah, it's a difficult question. I guess lots of answers. One answer is don't worry too much about it. You don't have to practice with open eyes. Although I think the counter argument would be, I think one reason the northern schools of Buddhism, notably the Tibetan school, practices with eyes open, is that they want you to integrate your practice into your life, right? The southern schools, a lot of Theravada schools, have eyes closed or partly open, which is good for cutting out distractions, because 80 or 85% of the information comes through our eyes. But the trouble is, we want our practice to be usable in our everyday life, and in our everyday life we're going around with our eyes open. And so if you train yourself, if you habituate yourself to only be mindful and aware, only practice Vipassana with your eyes are half closed or closed, you won't be used to doing it when your eyes are open in your ordinary life. So I guess my thought for you, Annie, is, unless you have some eye problem, because my question is, do you normally go around the world feeling tired with your eyes open as you go through your day? If you do, then maybe you have some medical condition that needs help. My guess is you may not, in which case then it's probably more likely that you're straining in your practice, right? It's a very common thing in practice that we are either too tight or too loose in our practice, right? The too tight is we're straining too hard, we're concentrating too hard, we're trying too hard, we're too tense. Now the too loose is we're a bit too, basically lazy, unconcerned, sleepy, dozy. And either of those actually is considered a dualistic extreme in our practice. There's a famous story of Buddha talking to a player of a stringed instrument who asked him, how should I practice? And he said, well, how does your instrument sound the best? And he said, when it's neither too tight nor too loose, right? Where the string is just the right tension. And the Buddha said, yes, and it should be the same with your practice. So as with all things in Buddhism, we are seeking this middle way, neither too tight nor too loose. So for Annie, all I can say for now is maybe find a way of just noticing if you're approaching your practice with a little too much tightness, a little too much tension. See if you can relax a little and see if that allows you to practice with open eyes a little longer. I'm just going to see if anyone else has any questions. I'll just give another couple moments either on the chat or in the Google Doc. And no, in which case, thank you all once again. Have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you next week.